Is my microphone live? Can you hear me all right? Yeah, very good. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to speak to you tonight. As stated, I'm very, very fortunate in that I get to explore some really interesting places, meet some really interesting people, and see some amazing things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work done by butterfly conservation in the north of England tonight. We are a kind of charitable organisation that's probably medium-sized. We have between 80 and 90 staff. We have about a third of those staff are either ecologists or conservation managers or people who direct conservation action and undertake conservation action. We're also supported by a really good network of branches that are split regionally. This area is covered by North East branch, and the branches themselves are generally run by keen volunteers with an incredible amount of knowledge and deliver sort of some really good conservation action on the ground. By way of background, I've worked for butterfly conservation for coming up for 20 years, and I started off as a project officer working in North East England, working on dingy skipper butterflies, grayling butterflies, brownfield habitats, limestone grasslands, that sort of thing. Then I kind of spread my wings, as it were, and moved into North Yorkshire, where I kind of worked on Duke of Burgundy, which is I'm going to talk about shortly, and pearl-bordered fritillary butterflies and some of the rarer moths down there. I've run projects in Cumbria, north and south, and middle come to that. I've worked in the Yorkshire Dales. So I've kind of been around a bit. And prior to working at butterfly conservation, I studied and did a PhD looking at the habitat requirements and behaviour of the large heath butterfly on the Northumbrian border mires. So, I do have that local link too. I kind of followed in the footsteps of some really knowledgeable guys. Tim Melling, who did a PhD on the spot variation on the large heath butterfly, and of course Harry Eales, who'll be known to quite a lot of you, who showed me around so many of the peat bogs with which he was familiar. So, moving on, I cover 6 counties in the north of England. That would be Yorkshire, Durham and Northumberland in the east, and Cheshire, Lancashire and Cumbria in the west. I don't get to Cheshire very much because unfortunately their butterfly population, they don't have as many rare species as most of the other counties. This is an area I'm going to start with talking about the limestone grasslands south of Pickering and Helmsley. I should add that the train reference is a site near Pickering. That's the North York Moors Railway, and you can just about see down the side of the track, I don't know if you can see my cursor, all those primroses growing alongside the railway track, and that was actually the last refuge of the last Duke of Burgundy colony to the north of Pickering. It was on that little tiny, it was restricted to that little tiny strip next to the railway. So I'll talk about some of the work that butterfly conservation has done over the years to try and encourage that butterfly's recovery. So, as I mentioned, we've got two colony networks, if you like, in North Yorkshire. We've got one set of sites to the north of Pickering and Thornton Dale in the east, and we've got some wonderful sites to the northwest of Helmsley that run down through those dales of Thurrodale, Gowerdale, Caydale and Rydale. These are all areas where you get limestone outcrops and where you get the Duke of Burgundy. Prior to the mid-1990s, we didn't know much about these butterflies. We didn't even know where the sites were, a lot of them where they were found. And it's fair to say that a lot of the sites, you know, although they're limestone grasslands, they're actually not farmed, generally. They're not grazed, they're not managed, they're not, most of them aren't designated as sites of scientific interest, even though there's really good floristic components to them. And, you know, there was a huge problem back then of these fragments of limestone grassland just disappearing under scrub, which might be good for carbon sequestration and so on, but was threatening a lot of the flora and fauna that were present there. Prior to 2008, I mentioned the role our volunteers play in conserving them. We were able to maintain some of the colonies through, you know, sort of people turning out, giving away their Saturdays and Sundays to you know, keep woodland clearings open and to manage scrub. But overall, it was very, very, you know, very, very basic maintenance regime. We weren't really seeing the butterfly expand back into areas where it used to be found. Come 2008, we actually got a grant of £234,000 from a company called Wren, which is a company that at that time was redistributing landfill tax money to environmental causes, if you like. And we were able to, you know, get a lot of people interested in these rare butterflies, primarily the Duke of Burgundy and pearl border fritillary were the target species. And we were able, you know, even more importantly, we were able to hire in contractors to manage some of the scrub issues on some of these sites. And you can see from the, you know, they're almost like Nicholas's old hedgerows sort of thing, some of those big, thick old hawthorns. They've been there a long, long time. And they've, you know, really impacted on the ground floor underneath. And those are actually limestone grasslands, but you can kind of see the bare ground because of the amount of shade cast by those thick old hawthorns on that particular site on the left. So we were able to manage about 36 sites in total on a scale which had not been previously possible, just because we had this contractor input. We weren't, you know, we could get people out with machines and kit, and we were able to, you know, open up some wonderful areas where the grassland was able to recover, and so were the butterflies. And just to give you some idea of scale, this is the top end of Caydale, which is kind of between Sutton Bank and Helmsley, roughly speaking, for those of you who know the area. These little grey dots are actually fire sites, and each of those would be, you know, they would have kind of encompassed these 2 desks and a bit more sort of thing. So, you know, those are substantial areas that we've been opening up. We haven't taken all the scrub off by any means, and it's, you know, but what we have done is, you know, massively increase the area of available habitat for these rare species to breed in. That grant has now expired, of course, but we're still massively indebted to volunteers who help keep those sites open, which is, you know, once the heavy lifting's been done, actually maintaining those sites becomes more of a manageable thing to do, more scalable if you like. So has this worked, this process of scrub management worked? These are just very, very simplistic graphs that show, we have volunteers who count the number of, do single day visits to all the Duke of Burgundy sites. They'll visit maybe 2, 3 or 4 times per year, if you like, in the flight period. And these are the maximum counts recorded from all the Duke of Burgundy sites. So you can see that around about, forget 2001, that was, or 2002 was foot and mouth year. The figure there is not reliable, but you can see that it, from a relatively low level, the numbers have really, really dipped. We were able to pull them back with volunteers a little bit up to about 2008, and we got this big influx of money. And you can see since then the numbers have really kind of recovered quite well. On top of that, we've also seen the number of sites expand. We were down to 8 sites in the Helmsley network, prior to us getting the grant. And we've kind of got it back up to 15, which is kind of roughly in the ballpark of where the species was at in the mid-1990s when the initial surveys were undertaken. Similarly at Pickering, this is the other site, the one next to the railway. We've kind of seen numbers there recover, not to the same extent, it's not as big an area, there's not as many sites. But, we've seen a similar pattern of increase, albeit at smaller scale. And the number of sites has gone from that little strip down by the side of the railway from, just that site. We've now got 4 sites in that network. So the actual programme of conservation work's really delivered. And I am a Yorkshireman, and as everyone knows, we're renowned for being modest sort of thing. And we can see, if this works, what the trends are for the Duke of Burgundy in northwest England. This is on the Morecambe Bay limestones, and you can see there's been a sort of pretty precipitous decline over a long period of time. We can go to the southeast, where things are a little bit more stable, but the species isn't doing terrifically well. We can go southwest, not doing great there. But in North Yorkshire, lo and behold, we've got this increase in abundance sort of thing. So, that input of effort has really, really helped conserve that species in that landscape. And it's worth noting that attitudes are changing in the countryside. Most of these sites are on private shooting estates where the prime income is from people who pay a lot of money to shoot pheasants. You're talking about income streams that may be in the ballpark of £8,000 to £10,000 a day on some of these steeply banked sites. It's a real day out for people who like shooting. So we can't offer a lot in comparison to that to the estates, who in the 1990s were reluctant to even let people on to survey. By the 2000s, things had moved on. They were kind of interested in the Duke of Burgundies a bit, and they were prepared to let volunteer work parties happen on the land. By 2010s, they were letting people like me bring in contractors to kind of manage the scrub on a kind of much wider scale, much more intensive level of work. And now we're actually at a state where some of the estates actually pay butterfly conservation to monitor the butterflies and to basically draw management plans for how we should be conserving Duke of Burgundy on their land. So, things are really, really, there's a real sea change going on there. I personally think it's great. Whatever your views on shooting, it's really, really good that some of these rare species are sort of doing okay. Right, this is a moth. It's got some links to Northumberland, so hopefully it'll be kind of interesting. This is another species I've worked on. This is dark-bordered beauty moth. That's a male. The female, if you see that burgundy band, the outer band, if you like, the band on the female kind of fizzles out to a point at the wingtip, and she's much, much paler coloured, a paler yellow colour sort of thing. So the two sexes can be told apart. And this is a kind of partnership effort to conserve this moth, which is possibly England's rarest, in that we only know one site in England where it occurs. In that site where we find the moth is Strensall Common near York. The problems it faces are that its numbers are less than a tenth than they were, 10 to 15 years ago. Its host plant has declined in abundance. It lays its egg, well, its caterpillars feed on creeping willow, which is a dwarf shrub sort of thing, probably because there's more leaf matter on it. The females seem to prefer larger plants to lay their eggs on or near to. The plants are smaller and fewer than they were 10 to 15 years ago. We believe that's down to overgrazing by sheep. The common is grazed by both sheep and cattle, and we think that the grazing isn't possibly right for the plant. We know that a lot of the shoots that bear the catkins get chewed off, so lots of years it doesn't seem to produce seed in the way that it should. The recruitment of young seedlings doesn't seem to be really particularly great in lots of years, although that might always have happened. There are concerns about the drainage regime on the site, maybe linked to climate. Certainly the Ministry of Defence, because a large part of the site is a military training area, there are more days now in winter where they can't train the troops on it because the ground conditions are too wet. Probably down to original drainage systems that were present on the site being kind of abandoned as parts of efforts to alleviate flooding around York, perhaps. The site seems really dry in the summer now, a lot of the time, which exposes it to the risk of wildfires. So this kind of fluctuation of the water table doesn't seem to be doing the larval host plant, the creeping willow, any good at all. So what we've been doing is trying to protect the best areas of creeping willow by establishing these little enclosures, and the pockets of plant itself are quite small in lots of the site. They're not huge expanses of food plant, but we've been erecting sort of semi-permanent fences to keep the livestock off the creeping willow, or to minimise the impact on it at times of the year when it's most vulnerable. We've also, one of our volunteers, Anne Chapman, has perfected a technique of propagating creeping willow from seed, which is a story almost in itself. And we've also had volunteers who've been growing on the creeping willows to be transplanted out onto site to try and boost the naturally occurring food plant there. It really is a moth in a precarious condition. Normally I would just prefer to manage the habitat and let it look after itself, but in this instance I think we might well lose it if we don't take every single measure possible. This is more volunteer effort by the Environment Agency giving up their work time, and I think the guy in the cage has kind of just realised he shouldn't be standing where he's standing, sort of thing, if he wanted to get home that night. But okay. But no, we're really grateful to the Environment Agency. We did let him out in the end. This is not a good news story. We thought it was working around 2016, 2017, 2018. We did get a bit of a rebound of the moth, and its numbers are monitored on probably once or twice a week through the flight period. But sadly, its numbers have really declined again in the last 4 years, sort of thing. So it is really hanging on. The kind of one glimmer of hope with this is that the area of the site that's monitored is actually outside the live firing area. that's the only area we can get volunteers on to monitor. It seems to be a little bit better in the part of the site where we can't monitor it on such a regular basis. So the bit where the monitoring transect is carried out is actually the part of the site where it's faring the worst. But even so, it's a moth that's struggling. Another project which I've recently overseen is limestone Lepidoptera, a project that was run in the Yorkshire Dales by my former colleague Kay Andrews, who's now got a job with Friends of the Lake District after a project funding finished. But Kay was looking at some really rare butterflies and moths of the Yorkshire Dales. Her target species included 2 butterflies, northern brown argus and small pearl-bordered fritillary, and 6 pretty rare moths of which we know very little. Hopefully my colleague Ryan's going to find out a bit more about these, but some of the moths include least minor, which is the top left, yellow ring carpet, which is the top right, chestnut coloured carpet on the bottom right, and forester moth. So, there's some really attractive species in there. And we, it's fair to say that their kind of spread is scattered. So we've got, if this area down here is Lower Wharfdale, so we'll be going up to kind of Littondale round about here. We're going out kind of... this is the forester moth. This is round Wensleydale, round kind of Aysgarth Falls area, just to the north of there. We've got records of least minor, that's kind of, although it's actually in Cumbria, this is in the Yorkshire Dales National Park boundary, so that's up by Great Asby Scar and round that way, sort of thing. So there is a scatter of really rare moth species in parts of the Yorkshire Dales, and Kay was lucky, and it was mentioned earlier that I was lucky enough to get out on site. She was even luckier than me in terms of the Dales. She got to look for some of these wonderful creatures and managed to find quite a few. So we were able to, through Kay's work, identify new sites for some of these rare species. For things like the golden ring carpet, the one on the top right of that screen, we actually found out that, it's one of the moths that are drawn to light. You can light trap it, but for reasons unknown, it actually responds far better to really low-powered traps with very dim lights on than it does really, really bright ones. Don't ask me why, but it seemed to be that the real, the tiny dim traps were pulling them in more. And Kay was able to lend out traps and pheromone lures to local volunteers. I'll come on to pheromone lures a little bit later, but essentially we were able to use a synthetic pheromone for barred tooth strike, one of the target moth species, which essentially releases a scent plume from an impregnated rubber bung, if you like, and it pulls in male moths up from downwind that are kind of fooled into thinking it's a signalling unmated female sort of thing. So it's a really effective tool in terms of surveying the species. There's not a huge number of pheromones available, but we were quite lucky that the University of Kent was able to develop this pheromone. We were able to use it for some of the surveys. Also, this kind of information ties into monitoring because, previously I've shown graphs on the screen that depict counts undertaken, using time counts or transect counts. They're quite easy things to record in the daytime. But with night flying moths, in terms of determining changes in abundance, it's really, really tricky sort of thing, because when you do a butterfly transect, when you're doing the monitoring, you record under, certain conditions, when temperatures within a certain range, when the sun's shining, within certain periods, say between 10 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the evening when the butterflies are active. All these variables you can kind of work within to ensure that your data are kind of reliable. With moths, it's really, really tricky, particularly with ones that fly at night, because there are so many factors. You can set a light trap, but you don't really have an idea as to how attractive each different species of moth finds it. Not all moths are attracted to light at all. Some are weakly attracted, some are really, really pulled in from quite large distances away. But it's kind of difficult to gauge. Then you've got competing things like, the state of the moon, for example. If you're trapping under a bright moon, that will impact your result, sort of thing. The variables are much, much harder to control, and it's kind of harder to get to grips with, being able to monitor the moths numerically, which, would give us the precision we're able to attain with monitoring butterflies. Also, we were able to, or Kay was able to, in the Dales, trial some practical conservation measures. And here, the plants on the two bottom photographs towards the centre and right are attempts to grow wild privet from cuttings. Now, that's to conserve the barred two-striped moth, the ones that are in the pheromone trap on the bottom left. And the reason we're keen to get wild privet established more widely is because barred two-striped moth has two main larval hosts. It feeds on, as caterpillars feed on wild privet, or they feed on ash trees, young ash. Now, most of the sites in the Dales, the main site has got both plants, but most of the other sites where it's found, and there aren't many, it feeds on ash. And the same in Morecambe Bay. You get this species in Morecambe Bay limestones as well. And there, its larval host is almost exclusively ash, which wouldn't be a problem. There's loads and loads of ash. Problem is, loads and loads and loads of them are dying. So what do? Do we kind of leave it to see what happens? Do we kind of, or do we try an experiment and see whether we can establish privet to at least ensure that if the worst comes to the worst and the ash take a real hit off dieback and they disappear from lots and lots of sites, it may be that getting an understory of privet established here and there might be sufficient to kind of retain the populations. So it's a work in progress. We plant some stuff out and we're kind of monitoring how those plants are doing. In terms of the Dales butterflies, we've got the two target species of northern brown argus, which we're fortunate to get in County Durham and a few sites in Northumberland. It's quite widespread in the north. And in the Dales is probably, in the north of England terms, the main landscape for that species. There are more northern brown argus sites in the Yorkshire Dales than in any of the other counties that I cover. And Kay was able to go around a lot of the sites to, a lot of these sites haven't been surveyed since 2003, I think, when I was doing the work with a couple of other guys. We found out the original distribution of this species, when it really did used to be a good job that I used to do, where I just used to be able to walk about and find where things were. But Kay has been back to visit a lot of these sites, and she was able to establish that in terms of northern brown argus, it's doing really well. It seems that, as Nicholas, the previous speaker, mentioned, where the farmers have been paid to do things, they've been paid, a lot of them, to reduce the levels of grazing, and that's had a real positive effect on northern brown argus. The numbers seem to be really good, and it seems to actually be doing well in a lot more areas than it used to be, which is great. She was also able to deliver management advice to farmers, and you know, have input into the stewardship schemes that help to pay to farmers to protect these species. Contrast that with the small pearl-bordered fritillary, which is the species on the far right. That one has got far less of a presence in the Dales and doesn't seem to be doing terrifically well. But nonetheless, Kay was able to deliver management advice on the site, you know, on some of the sites that were there, sort of thing, and you know, assess the habitat to find out why the species wasn't doing well. It seems that it's just possibly that the sites are too scattered and too few, so that, you know, it's quite you know, hostile environment, and it may be that if colonies go extinct, it takes them a long, long time to be recolonised by you know, from other populations, purely because the sites are too widely separated. Right, okay, that's the Dales, so we'll talk about Cumbria now for a bit. In 2004, just after I started with butterfly conservation, this species was nearly extinct in Cumbria. There was one site that still supported the butterfly, and you know, that's the butterfly on the top right. On the bottom right is a picture of its caterpillars that form these, you know, quite big communal webs in the vegetation where the caterpillars feed on devil's bit scabious. And in 2004, we were down to one larval web on one site. Now, each larval web represents the progeny of the same female, sort of thing. So straight away, what was left was almost certainly going to be you know, a serious case of inbreeding, even if they survived. Because this is a protected species, we had to obtain a licence from Natural England to take the larvae into captivity, because it was quite clear that it was a species that was on its way out. And we were able to take the larvae into captivity. We also collected some larvae from Scottish sites on Islay, and we were able to breed through 3 different strains of marsh fritillary, a pure Cumbrian strain, a Scottish Cumbria cross, and a pure Scottish strain in captivity. We had volunteers, you know, doing a lot of the hard work for this, and in the meantime, while all this captive breeding program was going on, we were able to work with farmers and with Natural England and with other organisations who own or manage land to try and bring some of the habitat back into condition. Basically, there'd been a lot of sites where grazing had been taken off altogether, sort of thing, which had allowed the grasses to get too rank, which you know, began to exclude the devil's bit scabious, which the butterflies need, but also make the conditions a lot cooler near ground level, so the caterpillars have more difficulty in completing their life cycle, because they're kind of, the cooler temperatures at ground level slow their development. So, as mentioned, we established a captive bred population led by volunteers mainly, and we were able to also grow on lots and lots of host plants. Like a lot of these rare butterflies, it's actually relatively easy to breed them in captivity. They're just absolutely crap at breeding in the wild, which presents difficulties, sort of thing. It's really getting the habitat condition right. That's like so many of these things, they will breed if the conditions are right, but breeding them in captivity is an absolute doddle. That's an egg batch on the top right, just to show you how the females lay their eggs on the underside of the devil's bit scabious. So after three years, we determined that some of the sites were suitable for release. By this point, we had literally thousands of captive bred larvae that we were desperate to get rid of, to be honest, because they were eating lots of scabious. We had to grow lots and lots of plants to feed them. And we put them out on the initial 4 sites in 2007. Between 2007 and 2011, we got them out onto 12 sites in total. And it's been really successful. We've got loads and loads of marsh fritillaries breeding in the wild now. It's now been recorded as breeding on 28 sites. You know, these are sites where it's spread out to, and you know, these are where the sites roughly, in terms of North Cumbria, where the butterflies were released at. And this is kind of what's happened since. You know, we've got them right down to this one on the very bottom right is actually too far north. It should be down by Killington Lake, which is a little bit further south. But it's really spread out, and it's really established itself well in a lot of new sites and new populations. You know, there's been a tremendous amount of management activity by, you know, partners like RSPB, National Trust, Cumbria Wildlife Trust, who've helped collectively to get the land into condition. Natural England have done a huge amount of work as well, ensuring that the farmers are paid to manage the land appropriately, sort of thing. And, you know, all these sites are kind of rush pasture grassland where, you know, traditionally the marsh fritillary was found in Cumbria. What's been really interesting, I think, is that the populations of caterpillars that we got from Isla, on that habitat, the butterfly tends to behave quite differently. Quite often breeds on really quite small flushes, on little tiny scabious plants that grow out of a carpet of sphagnum moss. You've probably seen places like that dotted around the countryside, sort of thing. The Cumbrian ones never used to use that habitat, but since we've put this kind of hybrid back, the Cumbrian Scottish cross, there is some evidence that it's doing the same thing there. It's actually breeding on some of the flushes, which, you know, it's interesting to kind of consider whether it's because the genetic makeup of the species that put back is different, so it is kind of geared towards using habitat differently. It's really, really interesting. But if that's the case, it really does make available a far more scattered area of habitat even these butterflies represent. So, you know, it may be that some of these odd sightings, particularly, you know, south of Whitehaven and St Bees Head, where there is none of the kind of rush pasture that the species seems to be breeding in the north. It's tended to wonder whether these, you know, these butterflies that people are seeing are actually using a different habitat down there. You know, the English marsh frit, if you like, was always considered fairly sedentary species. It was thought it didn't easily move between sites, but it, you know, it may be that the Scottish counterparts are behaving differently. Something to think about anyway. Oops. So, as with a lot of these things, you know, the reintroductions work well. Loads of volunteer efforts. We've got people out left, right, and centre. Counting webs, my colleague Ryan over there has helped with this sort of thing, and it's a popular activity in the end of August to go out and count the number of these communal webs of the caterpillars. Counting the webs is a kind of alternative to counting the adult butterflies. You know, the name marsh fritillary kind of is indicative of a butterfly that lives in wet conditions. You've got a relatively short flight period, lots of sites to get around, not much good weather. It makes much more sense to go out and actually count the caterpillar webs as a kind of metric for assessing how abundant that species is on each of the different sites it occupies. It works better because you've got a bigger window of opportunity. You can get lots of people out on sites to count the webs and so on, with none of the time constraints and weather requirements that counting the adult butterflies would need. Unsurprisingly, we started off from a position of no webs at all, or one web, to having lots of webs. So it's obvious we're going to get a positive graph on that one, sort of thing. It's worked well. Moving south of Cumbria, you this is almost a talk in itself, the amount of work we've done in the Morecambe Bay limestones for some of the butterflies and moths there. Again, a bit like the North York Moors with the Duke of Burgundy and the pearl-bordered fritillary, the problems faced by some of these rare species is lack of management. In this case, specifically lack of woodland management sort of thing. Some of the rare fritillaries need a really hot microclimate for their caterpillars to develop in. They just don't get that under, canopy, woodland canopy sort of thing. So what we've been able to do over there, similar in a way to the North York Moors, is to open up, wide ride systems through woodlands, creating sunlit habitat for some of these rare species to breed in. And, traditionally we've been able to get funding to conserve species like the high brown fritillary in the centre, the pearl-bordered fritillary on the right, and the Duke of Burgundy on the left. And, all these species kind of breed in these limestone woodlands in South Cumbria. We've also got things like the white-spotted sable moth, Anania funebris, which is a kind of micro moth, a wonderful little thing, a day flyer, and that has caterpillars that feed on goldenrod. And woodland management of this kind promotes the growth of that plant, and it seems from the limited information I've got for people who actually look for the caterpillars of this moth, that it too needs sunlit conditions. It doesn't seem to use the goldenrod that grows in the shade very much. And just really, I could stand here and talk about so many species that we've researched and looked at. We've got things like ardent and sable moth on the top left. We do larval searches for that. The picture underneath it is of one of its caterpillars spun into some bog myrtle. I mentioned the barred tooth striped. There it is on a bottom left on an ash branch sort of thing. Small pearl-bordered fritillary, dingy skipper. Small blue, the one second row from the left at the bottom. That's a species that's found on the Cumbrian coast. It's very much it lives on old steelworks sites, brownfield sites, very much under pressure from housing developments. We've introduced that to some of the industrial sites in the Tees Valley and Teesmouth, where there's lots and lots of its food plant, kidney vetch, lots of the right habitat. It's the only way really we can effectively mitigate the losses sort of thing. So conscious that time's getting on, we've got netted carpet moths, which is the moth with the netted wings, if you like, at the bottom. That's its caterpillar, bottom right. Scarce vapour moth we're doing a lot of work on. And there's loads and loads of people I need to thank for this. It's all places I've been, things I've seen sort of thing, but really it's the volunteers and other members of staff that help deliver this. The conditions that some people get out in to help us out and deliver some of this work is amazing. And it's just, I could thank so many people who've provided information, provided resource, helped us gather data, helped publish reports, so on and so forth. It's just, the list is endless sort of thing. There's people who research the plants that we need that tell us about where the, weirdest of host plants for some of these rare moths particularly grow. We wouldn't be half as effective in surveys if we didn't know where to look to start with. There's just so many different people sort of thing that have helped us out over the years. I mean, you kind of get the picture anyway, but we're dependent on so much expertise and so much goodwill and so much knowledge from people in the wider community. A couple of species we'll be working on this summer. I mentioned large heath. We're very, very keen to survey a lot of large heath sites this summer. I mean, basically it's found in Lancashire Forest of Bowland, it's found in Cheshire, it's found in North and South Cumbria, lots of sites in Northumberland. Northumberland is the most important county for large heath in England. It's got more sites than any other county. we're very, very keen for people to record this butterfly. So if anyone's in a position to help with that survey, I know you've got your own priorities and your own targets sort of thing, but late May to the end of June, if anyone's able to lend a hand with that, please give me a shout before I go tonight. There's also a moth, large red-belted clearwing we're keen to look at using pheromone lures. It seems to be a species that's numbers have really, really declined massively in the last decade, and we would like to know whether that's true or whether it's just a kind of artifact of people not targeting them in the way that they used to when the pheromone lures first came out. I mentioned pheromone lures a couple of times. This is that trap is about so big, it's about maybe 10 inches tall. The little black disc on the top is a cap to a little cage. You put a little rubber bung in there that's impregnated with this synthetic pheromone that is a simulation of the scent released by an unmated female. And if we can get this to work, I don't know whether we can, it worked earlier. And it's really effective. This is 6-belted clearwing on the Devon cliffs, and you can see I literally put the trap down, started my camera phone going, and those males were pulled out of the vegetation. For some species, it's really, really effective, and you know it's a good means of determining whether the species is present. Okay, and just to prove it's not a fluke, this is current clearwing, and the effect is much the same. This species quite often breeds in mature currants on allotments and gardens sort of thing. We're not targeting this species, it's large red-belted clearwing that we're targeting, which is the one on the right there. And I think that's just about it, but if anyone wants to help with surveys, please give me a shout at the end. Thank you.